Most people saw scrap metal waiting for the scrapyard. Rochelle Brooks saw a future. What began with a rusted structure and a handful of salvaged materials would eventually change more lives than her own. Subscribe for more inspiring stories, and let's begin. At 46 years old, Rochelle had become the kind of person society learns to look past. If you drove through Gary, Indiana in the spring of 2025, you might have seen her sitting in the driver's seat of an aging blue Dodge Caravan parked behind a vacant furniture store. Hard times have a strange way of making people invisible. Rochelle hadn't always lived that way. For 14 years, she worked as a maintenance technician for a local school district. She fixed leaking pipes, replaced broken ceiling tiles, repaired doors that refused to close, and kept old buildings functioning long after they should have been replaced. She was the person people called when something stopped working. Then the budget cuts came. Positions disappeared. Overtime vanished. A year later, so did her job. At first, she thought she could recover. Then the savings account got smaller. Then the overdue notices started arriving. Then the apartment was gone. What surprised her most wasn't losing a place to live. It was how quickly people changed the way they looked at her afterward. Not openly, not cruelly. Just enough to remind her she no longer belonged where she once did. Rochelle spent 13 months living out of her van, moving from parking lot to parking lot. Then one windy afternoon in April, while walking past a salvage yard on the east side of town, something caught her attention. Behind a rusted chain-link fence sat an old steel storage structure, waiting to be hauled away for scrap. The roof sagged in the middle, and rust covered most of the exterior. A forklift operator was already discussing how to move it. Most people saw metal worth recycling. Rochelle stopped walking. She stood there watching for nearly a minute. Because after years spent repairing things others had given up on, she had learned something important. Sometimes, the difference between junk and opportunity is simply the person looking at it. And, standing there with less than $30 in her pocket, Rochelle couldn't shake the feeling that everyone around her was missing something. The salvage yard sat between a railroad spur and an abandoned concrete warehouse that had been empty for so long that weeds were growing through cracks in the loading dock. It wasn't the kind of place people visited unless they were looking for cheap parts, scrap metal, or something nobody else wanted. Rochelle came back the next morning, then again the day after that. The structure behind the fence kept pulling her attention. Up close, it looked worse than she remembered. Roughly 8 feet wide and 12 feet long. It had once been a portable storage unit used at construction sites. Years of neglect had not been kind to it. Rust covered most of the steel panels. Several sections along the lower walls had corroded completely through. One corner of the roof sagged enough to collect rainwater. There were no windows. Most of the original plywood floor had deteriorated years earlier, leaving only sections of the steel frame exposed. When the wind blew through the holes in the walls, the entire structure made a low metallic groan. Most people would have called it finished. Marcus Hill certainly did. Marcus owned the salvage yard and viewed everything through the lens of value. Not necessarily future value, scrap value. When Rochelle finally asked about the structure, Marcus laughed. "That thing," he said. "I'm cutting it up next week." He explained that the steel was still worth something as scrap. Not much, but enough. Rochelle walked around it slowly, running her hand across the rusted panels. Marcus evaluated the structure by its scrap value. Rochelle evaluated it by what it could become. "How much?" she asked. Marcus shrugged. $25. Rochelle checked her wallet. 2 $10 bills. Nothing more. $20 was all she had left after paying for gas and food earlier that week. She showed him the money anyway. Marcus looked at the bills, looked at the structure, then back at Rochelle. Finally, he sighed. "Tell you what, pay me the $20, and you can keep it here until you figure out what to do with it." An hour later, the deal was done, and for the first time in months, Rochelle had a place she could legally work on. A few people nearby watched with amusement as Rochelle stood beside her purchase. One of them was Elijah Turner, a homeless veteran who lived in a tent several blocks away. He studied the rusted structure for a long moment before shaking his head. "Rochelle," he said, "you just paid $20 for a steel coffin." A few people laughed. Rochelle laughed too. Then she looked back at the structure. Elijah was right about one thing. It certainly looked like a coffin. But years later, when people told the story of what happened next, nobody would remember the rust. Nobody would remember the holes in the walls. They would remember what it became. The first thing Rochelle learned was that the storage unit looked worse up close than it did from the road. The rust wasn't just sitting on the surface. It had been spreading for years. Entire sections along the lower walls were covered in reddish-brown flakes that crumbled at the touch. In some places, she could push a screwdriver straight through the steel without much effort. Most people looked at that kind of damage and saw the end of a structure's life. Rochelle wasn't so sure. She had spent enough years fixing old buildings to know that appearances could be deceiving. What she didn't know was how to stop rust that had already taken over. So she went looking for answers. Most afternoons, she sat inside the Gary Public Library near the technology section, watching repair videos on a borrowed computer. One particular video caught her attention. It explained what rust actually was. Not dirt, not decay in the ordinary sense. Rust was oxidation, a chemical reaction that slowly breaks steel down over time. By the end of the week, she had watched it 11 times. She filled pages of a small notebook with sketches and notes. The solution, according to the video, wasn't to remove every trace of rust. The solution was to transform it. A few days later, she bought a wire brush and a bottle of rust converter from a discount hardware store. Then she got to work. The process was harder than she expected. For hours, she scraped loose rust from the walls, filling the air with orange dust. Tiny flakes covered her clothes and collected in her hair. By the second day, the skin on her palms had split open in several places. She wrapped strips of duct tape around her hands and kept going. Progress came slowly, inch by inch, panel by panel. Once the loose rust was gone, she brushed the converter onto the steel. The chemical reaction began almost immediately. The orange corrosion darkened and hardened as the liquid bonded with the surface. The rust converter transformed the active corrosion into a dark protective layer that helped slow further deterioration. Rochelle didn't fully understand the chemistry, but she understood the result. For the first time since she bought the structure, it looked like it might survive. And something else happened that week. People began stopping to watch. The same neighbors who had laughed when she bought the rusted unit now slowed down when they passed. A few asked questions. Others simply stood there for a moment before moving on. It was the first time anyone around the salvage yard seemed genuinely curious about what she was doing. With most of the rust finally under control, Rochelle turned her attention to what she considered the real problem. It wasn't electricity. It wasn't running water. It wasn't even heat. Those things mattered, but they could wait. The first thing a home needs is a floor. Most people never think about floors until they don't have one. But after spending more than a year sleeping in a vehicle, Rochelle understood something many people never have to think about. The ground steals heat. It does it quietly and constantly. Even when the air temperature feels manageable, cold soil beneath you acts like a giant heat sink, pulling warmth away from your body hour after hour. Blankets help from above. Sleeping bags help from above, but neither does much against cold coming from below. Rochelle had learned that lesson during too many winter nights. Fortunately, she also knew how buildings worked. 14 years of school maintenance had taught her that comfort often comes down to simple details people never see. One Saturday morning, she began gathering materials. Behind a distribution warehouse, she found several hardwood shipping pallets that had been discarded after a delivery. At a construction site dumpster, with permission from the foreman, she collected leftover foam insulation panels that were too small for the original project but still perfectly usable. A few days later, she bought several sheets of used plywood from an online marketplace for less than the cost of a restaurant meal. The materials didn't match. Rochelle didn't care. She wasn't building pretty yet. She was building practical. First, she leveled the steel frame as best she could. Then she secured the pallets together to create a raised platform. The foam insulation fit between the gaps, creating a barrier against the cold ground beneath. On top of that came the plywood, screwed down carefully and measured twice before every cut. It took 3 days of work. 3 days of lifting, measuring, trimming, adjusting, and starting over whenever something didn't line up correctly. By the time she finished, the transformation was impossible to miss. Before, Stepping inside meant standing on uneven dirt and exposed steel. The structure felt temporary, fragile, unfinished. Afterward, something changed. The floor was flat, solid, level beneath her feet. For the first time, it felt like a room. Rochelle sat on the plywood that evening as sunlight filtered through the holes in the walls. She looked around quietly for several minutes. The storage unit wasn't a home yet, not even close. There was still no insulation, no heat, no lighting, and no protection from winter. But the moment she finished the floor, the project crossed an invisible line. It stopped feeling like a rusted steel shell abandoned in a salvage yard. And for the first time, it no longer felt like a storage unit. The new floor solved one problem, but Rochelle knew it wouldn't solve the biggest one. Winter in northern Indiana wasn't defeated by a sheet of plywood. The real battle would be fought in the walls and ceiling. Every gust of wind that passed through the holes in the steel carried away heat. Every cold night would turn the structure into a metal refrigerator unless she found a way to stop it. The challenge was money. She didn't have much of it, so she did what she had done for months. She looked for materials other people no longer needed. Over the next 2 weeks, Rochelle made regular trips across the city. She collected leftover foam board from construction dumpsters, always asking permission before taking anything. She found several pieces of polyiso insulations stacked beside a renovation project where workers were replacing damaged panels. A local contractor even gave her a pile of scrap lumber that was headed for disposal. Rochelle saw building materials. She began with the walls. The steel shell remained on the outside, but she knew steel alone was terrible at holding heat. Metal transfers thermal energy quickly. If the inside touched the outside directly, warmth would escape almost as fast as it was created. The solution was layers. First came the steel skin, then a small air gap. After that, rigid foam insulation. Finally, thin plywood panels to create an interior surface. Each layer served a purpose, working together to keep heat where Rochelle needed it. Working alone was slow. Some days, she only completed a single section of wall before sunset. Other days' progress stopped entirely because she had to search for more materials. One afternoon, while installing insulation near the ceiling, she climbed onto an overturned paint bucket to reach the upper corner. The bucket shifted beneath her weight. Suddenly, it cracked. Rochelle lost her balance and hit the plywood floor hard. Pain shot through her right hip as she landed. She lay there staring at the unfinished ceiling, breathing slowly while the ache spread through her side. Most people probably would have called it a day. Rochelle considered it for about 5 minutes. Then she pushed herself back up. The insulation still needed to be installed. Winter wasn't going to wait for her hip to heal. By the end of the 3rd week, every wall had been covered. Every seam had been sealed. Every panel had been secured into place. The transformation surprised even Rochelle. The inside no longer looked like the rusted storage unit she had bought from Marcus Hill. The bare steel was mostly hidden behind clean wooden surfaces. Sound seemed different inside, too. The echoes were softer. The wind sounded farther away. Standing in the middle of the structure felt strangely calm. She couldn't fully explain it, but something fundamental had changed. 3 weeks later, something even stranger happened. One cold morning, Rochelle stepped inside before sunrise and immediately stopped walking. For the first time since she had started the project, the air inside felt noticeably warmer than the air outside. By early December, the structure had something it had never possessed before. A floor that blocked the cold ground, insulated walls that slowed heat loss, and a roof that no longer leaked every time the weather turned bad. But Rochelle understood that insulation doesn't create warmth. It only keeps warmth from escaping. To survive an Indiana winter, she still needed a heat source. The problem, as always, was money. A new propane heater was out of reach. Most of the models she researched cost more than she could justify spending. So she waited. Then one Saturday morning, while browsing a secondhand store on the west side of town, she found exactly what she was looking for. Sitting on a shelf between a camping stove and a box of fishing gear was a used portable propane heater. The price tag read $15. Rochelle checked the burner assembly, examined the safety valve, and inspected the housing for damage. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. She bought it immediately. Before she ever lit the heater, however, she focused on safety. Heat without ventilation can become dangerous very quickly. Propane consumes oxygen, and can produce carbon monoxide if used improperly. Rochelle knew enough about maintenance work to respect that risk. She cut a small vent opening near the upper wall and installed a simple hinged cover that could remain partially open while the heater operated. A few days later, she purchased a battery-powered carbon monoxide detector from a discount store and mounted it near the ceiling. Only after everything was in place did she test the system. The opportunity came during one of the coldest nights of the season. Outside, temperatures dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Frost-covered parked cars. Ice formed along the edges of puddles. The wind pushed through empty streets and rattled loose signs along the industrial district. Rochelle sat inside the structure and lit the heater. At first, nothing seemed remarkable. Then, the thermometer steadily climbed into the mid-50s. Outside, the air was cold enough to numb fingers in minutes. Inside, she had taken off her gloves. For the first time in well over a year, she wasn't calculating how to stay warm through the night. She was simply warm. The realization hit harder than she expected. She sat quietly in a folding chair near the wall, looking around the room she had spent months building piece by piece. The plywood walls reflected the soft glow of a battery lantern. The heater hummed quietly in the corner. The cold stayed outside. Tears rolled down her face before she even noticed them. She wasn't crying because she was sad. She wasn't crying because life had suddenly become easy. She cried because for well over a year, every night had been a struggle with discomfort, uncertainty, and cold. And now, for the first time since losing her apartment, she felt safe enough to relax. The rusted structure that people had laughed at was doing exactly what a home is supposed to do. It was protecting someone. And with that, one of the biggest questions surrounding the project finally had its answer. The first people who paid attention to Rochelle's project weren't city officials, contractors, or reporters. They were teenagers. Every weekday afternoon, a group of students from Roosevelt High School walked past the industrial lot on their way home. At first, the structure was little more than a joke to them. They called it the homeless shack. Sometimes they laughed when they saw Rochelle carrying pieces of lumber or unloading materials from a shopping cart. To a group of 16-year-olds, it looked ridiculous. An older woman spending months rebuilding what appeared to be a rusted storage box. Rochelle heard the comments. She pretended not to. Experience had taught her that some people mock things they don't understand. Then one afternoon, one of the students stopped walking. His name was Jordan Williams, 16 years old. Quiet, curious, the kind of kid who paid attention when everyone else was distracted. While his friends continued down the street, Jordan stayed behind and watched Rochelle install a small LED light strip along one of the interior walls. After a few minutes, he finally asked a question. "How are you going to power that?" Rochelle smiled. Most people only noticed the finished result. Jordan wanted to understand how it worked. The next day he came back, then the day after that. Before long, he was spending several afternoons each week helping Rochelle with small projects. She taught him the basics of electricity, batteries, and energy-efficient lighting. Jordan absorbed everything. Rochelle enjoyed teaching him. It reminded her of something she had learned years earlier while working in schools. Most young people are naturally interested in learning when they feel respected. Around the same time, Rochelle found a used solar panel at a community resale center. The frame was scratched and one corner was damaged, but it still produced electricity. A retired truck mechanic sold her an old marine battery for a fraction of its original cost. Over several weekends, Rochelle and Jordan installed the system together. The solar panel mounted to the roof. Wiring ran through protective conduit. The battery sat safely inside a ventilated compartment near the wall. When everything was connected, Rochelle flipped a switch. The LED lights came alive instantly, filling the small structure with bright white light. Jordan's eyes widened. "That's actually pretty cool," he said. Rochelle laughed. Word spread quickly. Soon a few of the same students who once mocked the structure began stopping by to see what Rochelle was building next. Some asked questions. Others offered help. The jokes slowly disappeared. In their place came curiosity, then respect. One evening, while the lights glowed overhead and the battery quietly charged from the day's sunlight, Jordan asked Rochelle why she had never given up. She thought about the question for a moment before answering. "Because where a person sleeps doesn't tell you what they're worth." Jordan never forgot that sentence. Years later, he would repeat it almost word for word during a graduation speech. But on that evening, it was simply a lesson shared between a teacher and a student inside a building that more and more people were beginning to see differently. By the beginning of spring, Rochelle's project had solved three of the biggest problems any shelter faces. It could keep out rain. It could hold heat. It had light after sunset. But there was still one thing missing that every home depends on, whether people think about it or not. Water. Not running water. Not indoor plumbing. Just a reliable way to access clean water without carrying heavy containers across town every few days. Rochelle had been thinking about the problem for weeks. Every time it rained, she watched water slide off the roof and disappear into the ground. Over the course of a year, more rainwater landed on that roof than Rochelle could ever realistically use. To Rochelle, that looked less like weather and more like an opportunity. She started collecting materials. An old food-grade plastic drum came from a restaurant supplier that was throwing out surplus containers. A section of aluminum flashing became a makeshift gutter. A simple filtration setup came together using inexpensive water filters and replacement cartridges purchased over time. None of it looked fancy, but it worked. Rain landed on the roof, flowed through the gutter, entered the storage drum, and passed through a basic filtration system. Rochelle's mainly used the water for cleaning and washing, while drinking water still came from refill stations in town. The setup wasn't designed to impress anyone. It was designed to solve a problem. Around that same time, another person had begun paying attention to Rochelle's project, though not for the same reasons as Jordan. His name was Doug Mercer. Doug worked security for several industrial properties in the area. For years, part of his job involved moving homeless people away from vacant buildings, loading docks, and parking lots. He wasn't a cruel man, but he had developed opinions over time. In his mind, most homeless people were irresponsible and brought problems wherever they went. Rochelle represented everything Doug thought he already understood. During the first few months, he drove past the structure almost every day. Sometimes he stopped. Sometimes he watched from a distance. Occasionally, he asked a question. Rochelle always answered politely before returning to work. What surprised Doug wasn't the project itself. It was the consistency. Every week, she was there, working, improving, learning, building. There were no shortcuts, no complaints, no excuses, just progress. Slowly, the assumptions he carried for years began to crack. One afternoon, he noticed Rochelle struggling to transport several sheets of plywood across town. Without saying much, Doug loaded them into his pickup truck and drove them over. A few weeks later, he loaned her a cordless drill, then a ladder, then a set of hand tools. Before long, the man who once viewed people like Rochelle as a burden had become one of the people helping her succeed. The change wasn't dramatic. It happened quietly, one conversation at a time. Months later, Doug admitted something to Jordan that stuck with him. The funny thing is, he said, I thought I knew people like Rochelle. Turns out, I never actually knew any. That may have been the most important lesson the project ever taught. Prejudice often grows in distance. It's easy to judge people you've never spoken to. It's easy to make assumptions about lives you've never lived. Understanding works differently. It requires proximity, conversation, time. The closer Doug got to Rochelle's story, the harder it became to hold on to the stereotypes he'd carried for years. And somewhere between the rainwater system and the borrowed toolbox, respect quietly took the place of judgment. Doug Mercer became one of the workshop's most reliable volunteers. The same man who once chased homeless people away was now teaching basic tool safety on Saturday mornings. By the summer of 2025, something unexpected had happened. Rochelle's project was no longer just Rochelle's project. What began as a rusted storage unit sitting behind a salvage yard had slowly become something much larger. People who had once watched from a distance were now asking questions. People who once doubted the idea were asking how they could build something similar. And perhaps most surprising of all, people who had spent years feeling forgotten were beginning to see a future for themselves. The first person to follow Rochelle's example was Elijah Turner, the same man who had jokingly called the structure a steel coffin months earlier. After spending enough time inside Rochelle's finished space, he stopped laughing. He found an old utility shed that was scheduled for demolition and started rebuilding it. Then another person did the same. Then another. By August, 5 small structures stood within walking distance of Rochel's original project. None of them looked exactly alike. Each one looked different, but they all shared the same purpose. They were built from discarded materials, improved through hard work, and designed to provide dignity rather than mere survival. Not everything was going smoothly. Several months earlier, Jordan had nearly failed algebra after missing several assignments. For a few weeks, he stopped showing up altogether. Rochelle eventually found him sitting alone outside a convenience store and reminded him that unfinished work only gets harder the longer you ignore it. The following week, he returned. What started as simple curiosity had grown into genuine commitment. He recruited several classmates from school, and before long, small groups of students were spending weekends helping move materials, clean work sites, and install insulation. Students showed up to learn new skills and be part of something positive. Rochelle noticed something interesting happening among the teenagers. The same students who had once referred to the structure as a homeless shack now talked about solar power, construction methods, and energy efficiency. More importantly, they were talking to people they previously would have ignored. The barriers between us and them were quietly disappearing. Around that time, a technical education teacher named Mr. Raymond Ellis heard about the project through Jordan. Curious, he visited one Saturday morning. What he found impressed him immediately. Not because the buildings were perfect. They weren't. What impressed him was the learning taking place. Students were developing practical skills. Adults were sharing knowledge. People from different backgrounds were working side by side. Within weeks, Mr. Ellis began organizing free weekend workshops. He taught basic tool safety, construction fundamentals, simple electrical concepts, and maintenance skills. Attendance grew every month. Everyone left with something valuable. Looking back, it became difficult to determine exactly when the collection of projects transformed into a community. Maybe it happened when people stopped working alone and started solving problems together. Whatever the moment was, it had clearly arrived. 5 small structures now stood where there had once been isolation. Conversations replaced silence. Cooperation replaced suspicion. And for the first time, people beyond the neighborhood began to hear about what was happening. Soon, local residents, community organizations, and even reporters started paying attention. It was no longer just a story about a woman rebuilding a discarded structure. It was becoming a story about people rebuilding faith in one another. And that was the moment the city finally started paying attention. By the summer of 2026, people came to see the structure for all kinds of reasons. Some wanted to learn about the solar panel mounted on the roof. Others were curious about the rainwater collection system or the insulation hidden behind the walls. A few simply wanted to see if the stories they had heard were true. They would walk through the door, look around, and ask Rochelle the same questions. How much did it cost? How long did it take? Where did the materials come from? Rochelle always answered politely, but the truth was that the most important part of the project had very little to do with the building itself. People came to see the building. They left talking about the people. The building was simply where the transformation happened. No one represented that better than Jordan Williams. When he first stopped to watch Rochelle work more than a year earlier, he was a teenager with one foot already out the door of high school. His grades were poor. His attendance was worse. He spent most days convinced that graduation belonged to other people. College seemed impossible. Trade school seemed unlikely. The future felt like something happening to someone else. Then he met Rochelle. What began as curiosity slowly became mentorship. Rochelle taught him how to install LED lighting, how batteries stored energy, how solar panels generated electricity, and how to solve problems one step at a time. But beneath every lesson about tools and construction was another lesson she never explicitly announced. Things that look broken are not always beyond repair. Jordan carried that idea with him long after he left the worksite each day. In May of 2026, he walked across the stage at Roosevelt High School and accepted his diploma. Rochelle sat in the crowd and cheered louder than she expected. A week later, Jordan arrived carrying a long rectangular package wrapped in brown paper. He handed it to Rochelle without saying much. Inside was a framed copy of his high school diploma. Rochelle looked at it, then looked at Jordan, confused. "Why are you giving this to me?" she asked. Jordan smiled. "Because if you hadn't taught me how to fix broken things," he said, "I never would have learned how to fix my own life." For a moment, Rochelle couldn't speak. Then she looked back at the framed diploma in her hands. She realized that out of everything she had built, this was the thing she was proudest of. Later that afternoon, she hung the frame on the wall beside the doorway. Because every time Rochelle looked at it, she was reminded of a lesson hidden inside the project from the very beginning. The steel underneath was always the same steel. What changed was how it was treated. Corrosion can be transformed into something useful. Human beings are not so different. A difficult past does not erase potential. Failure does not eliminate value. Sometimes people simply need someone willing to see what they can become. Most people looked at a rusted metal structure and saw scrap. Rochelle Brooks saw possibility, and as it turned out, that was exactly how she looked at every person she met. If Rochelle's story stayed with you, let me know which moment hit you the hardest. And before you go, tell me where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel.